take a moment to explain the direction and process. So we have our framework, and then we'll work our way out to the diagonals, following the arcs, putting in our corner elements and triangles, and then back to center. We'll fill the corner elements first, then we'll work the ends of each of the crosses, and then we come back to center and in concentric circles work our way back out. Here you see that I've already worked a couple of the corner elements. It doesn't really matter what order you do them in, as long as you do all the corners first. So we'll begin by coming all the way out to a corner. We'll run our thread underneath all of our tack stitches. And next, we'll work a short span of wrap stitches. Now, wrap stitches are not interlinked like typical buttonhole stitches. They're literally just coiling a thread around the foundation. Once we reach the right height, we'll throw the arcs off to the sides and work buttonhole stitches and picots across them, followed by detached buttonhole stitch triangles, which are connected to our foundation spines with some arcs and picots. So let's begin. I'm just going to wrap, and I'm putting the needle up, and the thread will come up and then down, and I'll hold it with my thumb. And I find that this particular directionality helps me get a very accurate and smooth wrap. The secret to a fine wrap is to make sure that you don't pull too tight. A loose and supple coil around the foundation thread will give you a nice solid strut that you can then stitch into later. The problem I've always encountered is that if I wrap too tightly around a core thread, then I don't have any room to get my needle into the strut or the long strand to be able to work stitches into it, and it becomes a bit of a fight, and we really don't want any bit of this to be a fight. Once we reach the right height, as we can see through our diagram, then we'll throw a passive thread off to the side, and you see how I'm locking it around that anchor point. And again, every time I do, I'm going under the foundation thread and under the tack, and that makes sure that everything is properly linked. Otherwise, when you remove the lace, you could have a piece of stitching that comes loose, and you don't want that. So I'll throw off to the side and then off to the other side, and then I'll stay on that second side and begin the work. And this is my preferred order of operations for this style of lace. Now, once you are accustomed to the design, you may find a way that works better for you, but this is how I do it. So you'll see me wrap the thread so that I can make my buttonhole stitch, and it's just a single link. It is not like a tailor's buttonhole stitch, which has an extra wrap at the top. This is, if you were doing a quilting kind of a stitch, this is more like a blanket stitch, a half hitch. Lots of different names for the same basic structure of thread wrapping around a core. So we'll work our stitches halfway across this arc, and then we're going to make a picot. So for the picot, you come up through the stitch you've just made, but don't pull the needle entirely through, and then you'll wrap 1, 2, 3, 4 times loosely, and then you'll see me secure with my thumb, grab the needle, and pull the thread through. And this essentially creates a little bullion knot right on the top of the stitching. And then I will pass the needle through the base of that stitch again, and that brings my thread back down to the working level, where I can continue making buttonhole stitches across the arc. As I work the remaining stitches on this arc, pay special attention to the direction that I'm turning the thread. Buttonhole stitches can be wrapped right facing or left facing, and in this instance I'm using a right facing buttonhole stitch. So the thread comes down on the right, up on the left, and the needle comes through, and that creates a half hitch with an open directionality to the right. Now to get to the other side, I'll pass the needle between the threads of the foundation line, and then I will come through the tack stitch on the opposite side. As I begin the stitches on this side, you'll see that they're twined the opposite direction. The thread comes down and up on the right, or down on the left and up on the right, and the needle comes through. The picot is worked in exactly the same way. The needle comes up, the thread is wrapped 4 times around the needle, and then the thread and the needle are drawn through. Make sure as you make your picots that you don't wrap these stitches too tightly around the needle. If you do, it makes it very difficult to draw the needle and the thread completely through the stitch. I'll make my remaining 4 stitches along this arc. Now the number of stitches along this arc may vary depending on the size that you've drawn your template and the size thread that you're using. Once the arc is complete, I will begin wrapping so that I can get up to the next level and make the triangles for the next portion of the design. I'll wrap 1, 2, 3 times. Once the 3 wraps are complete, I'll once again throw to the next tack stitch along the foundation perimeter. I'll pass the needle through the foundation stitches of the diagonal, through the foundation threads of the diagonal, under the foundation perimeter, and under the tack stitch. And I'll throw back, and then return. Now I will turn the work, and these buttonhole stitches are worked slightly differently. For an arc, you can pull your stitches relatively snug. For something where you're using detached buttonhole stitch, you want to make sure that your stitches are spaced slightly wider apart and that your tension is slightly less extreme. This leaves an open space at the top of the stitch where your needle can go through and make the next row. So we'll begin by making, in this case, 8 buttonhole stitches across the top. And I'm making them nice and loose with a decent space between them so that I have room to work. Now that the stitches are complete, I'll go and I will put the needle in the second one from the beginning. I don't want to go all the way to the beginning because I'm making a triangle, so we have to have fewer stitches on each passing row. But you'll see as I put that stitch in, I left a float across the top of the previous row. That float becomes the padding for the next row of stitches. So I have the head of the stitch of the previous row and a piece of thread giving me an extra thickness and making everything balanced and uniform. Now I will have to use magnifying glasses in order to see these stitches carefully and correctly, but I will make 1 stitch in the top of each of the previous stitches except for the ones at the ends. So where I had 8 stitches before, I'll end up with 6 stitches on this row, and then 4 stitches on the row after that, and 2 and 1, and so forth until the triangle is complete. So let's look at that again. I'm getting the needle into the stitch on the end. I'm pulling it snug so there's a float across the top, and I'm not pulling particularly tight. The stitches for rows of detached buttonhole stitch like this need to be less tight than your average stitch that you make for an arc. If you make them extremely tight, it'll be very hard to get your needle through them, and you may snap the head of the stitch, meaning that you have to rip out and begin again in that area. We don't want that. One thing you'll notice is that as you're working, when you do a row of buttonhole stitches like this, the beginning end of the row will try to curl under a little bit. So make sure that you put your needle tip in and drag the head of that stitch out so that you can put your needle in the correct place. Okay, This triangle is almost complete. That was 3 stitches. And now we're coming down to 2 stitches. And then finally, sorry, there's your second stitch. And then finally 1 stitch at the very tip. And I usually do 1 extra just to make sure the tip of the triangle appears extra pointy. Moving right on to the next element, once the final stitch at the point is complete, I will run the thread underneath the tack stitch that I made specifically for the point of these triangles, and this helps just keep the tip of the triangle aligned. My next task then is to throw the arcs that come off the top of this triangle. Now I have a tack stitch right in the middle of my diagonal that I can use to anchor the end of the arc. So I'll put the needle through, I'll come back, I'll go through the tip of the triangle once again, and then I'll throw to the corresponding tack stitch on the other side. Once again, going under the foundation and under the tack stitch so that I make sure it's looped around the foundation thread and secure. Then I'll go back through the point of the triangle and return to the outer perimeter and work my way into center once again. Now working these arcs is relatively simple. It is 4 buttonhole stitches, picot, 2 buttonhole stitches, or 3 depending on the size of your thread and spacing, 1 other picot, and then another 3 or 4 stitches to complete an arc. Then I'll work across the second span of arc on the opposite side of the triangle before wrapping my way down to the base and building up the triangle on the opposite side. I've made my 4 stitches now, and it's time for this picot. The needle comes up through the base of the stitch 1, 2, 3, 4 times around the needle tip, loosely held, and the thread is drawn through, and the picot snugged into place. The needle comes up through the base of the stitch on which the picot is made, and then a few more stitches are worked before our next picot. 1, and you'll notice I sometimes will take the needle and go back and pull the tip of a picot up so that it stays nice and tall. They can get crunched down a little bit if they're left alone. Sometimes you need to encourage them to stand up straight and tall. Here's my second picot. I may have wrapped that one a little bit tight. It was hard to pull through. There, you can see me using the tip of my needle to drag all of these picots back out to where they need to be, so they're very clear little nubs on the end of the stitches. And then I'll work my remaining buttonhole stitches and reach the center of the triangle point. Once I reach the center, I just tweak the state of my picots once again, making them stand up nice and tall, and then I just cross over to the other side, no magic to it whatsoever, and continue my stitches. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now a picot. Notice that I set the template down in order to use both hands to get the needle through to make the picot. Push the needle up through the stitch, wrap 4 times, and then draw through. Now see, that one got a little bit loose, so I had to use my needle to snug it down. I'll take a few stitches and I'll make a second picot. Notice how I'm using my fingers here. My hand holding is it's holding the card, but then my thumb reaches for the thread and grabs it up and keeps it in tension the entire time. You'll get used to this kind of maneuvering with making lace where every finger has a job. Those of you who know how to knit also understand every finger in the process has a job. It's just hard to get them all to work together. But you'll eventually fall right into it. Okay, that picot is complete. 1, 2, and then 3 and 4. And then what happens next is after these arcs are complete, I have to make the next triangle. So I'll put the needle through the foundation threads and then I will wrap my way back down to where the triangles are. You can see me aligning the wraps. With every pass of the needle, I'm pulling the thread into position. You don't want the thread on top of itself for these wraps. You want it to look like a little coil wrapped around the foundation. So now that I have made my way back down to the level of the base of the triangles, I'll put my thread through to the outer edge, and I'll repeat the process of building the triangle and throwing the arcs. With the final arcs completed, I'm going to join this arc to the center spine by going right through it, just like so. And then, sorry, I got caught around my little picot here, that'll happen. And then I'll wrap my way all the way to the center. Now I'm about to run out of thread, so I will probably pause between cuts and replace the thread for this. But here you can see how the wrapping is happening. And as we pick up on the next segment, I'll have a fresh thread for you. Thanks so much for watching.